Hello, everybody. Welcome to story time again from the Milledgeville Public Library. Well, actually, today I'm at the Dixon Public Library because I was out shopping and I didn't get home in time to tell a story from Milledgeville. So today you get a story from the Dixon Public Library. And today's story comes to us also from Europe. And it is a story of a young girl with very, very long hair. This is the story of Rapunzel. Once long ago, there was a husband and a wife, and they desperately wanted a child, but they had not been able to have one, not yet. And then one day, the wife gave the husband news that made him very, very happy. They were finally going to have a child. Now, anybody who has been around a woman who is pregnant knows that sometimes pregnant women's bodies want certain things. They're called cravings. And this particular woman, their house, where she liked to sit in her room doing her sewing and getting ready for the baby, she was on the second floor, and the window looked down into the neighbor's garden. Well, it just so happened that the neighbor had a very, very large garden. And it just so happened that their neighbor was a witch. Well, everyone was very careful to be, cautious about the witch and things in her garden. She was very, very, very proud of that garden. Well, one day, though, the wife looked down into the garden and she saw some plants. They were radishes, and they looked so delicious that she really, really, really wanted some. Now, anyone who's been around a pregnant woman knows that most of the time when she has a craving, you can't really argue with her. You just have to get her what she wants. And so the wife started to tell her husband about the wonderful radishes that she had seen down in the witch's garden and how she just really wanted some of those radishes. Well, the husband knew that he could not just ask the witch for radishes. She would not give them up. She never, ever, ever gave up what was in her garden. Never. But his wife asked so much, and she just needed those radishes. And, well, the long and the short of it is, one night when it was quite dark, the husband very carefully climbed over the wall, and he very carefully crept through the garden, and he pulled up some of those radishes, and he took them back to his wife, and she cleaned them off, and she cut them up, and she put them in a salad, and it was, delicious. Oh, it was wonderful. But a couple of days later, she had been thinking about that delicious salad with the radishes in it for several days, and now she wanted more. And so she told her husband, and he said, no, I should not climb back into the witch's garden. I do not know how I got in and out once without getting caught. I cannot do it again. I am sorry, wife, but I cannot. Well, she begged, and she pleaded, and she begged, and she pleaded for a couple of days, and finally he gave in. This time he waited until the night was at its darkest, and he climbed over the wall. And just as he bent down to pull up the radishes, suddenly his feet stuck to the ground, and he heard a voice that said, "Aha! I have caught you, you thief!" Oh, he knew the witch was behind him, but he could not move to run away. His feet were stuck to the ground. Well, the witch, she prowled around him, and she scolded him for stealing her radishes. And she said, "I am going to turn you into... I can't decide. Would you like to be a statue or a toad?" Well, the poor husband didn't want to be either one. You see, his wife was going to have a baby, and he wanted to be a father. That's what he wanted to be. And so he told the witch this. And the witch said, "Oh, a baby, eh? Very well. I will let you go if you will give me the baby when it is born." Well, goodness, no, he did not want to do that. But the witch was going to kill him or turn him into a toad or a statue or something horrible. And his wife would be left alone with the baby to care for. And he didn't want to leave his wife alone. And he didn't want to be a statue. And, well, eventually he decided to, yes, I will give you the baby when the baby is born. And he knew he had some time between now and when the witch would come for the baby to think of a way to get out of it, to save his poor child from being taken by the witch. Well, the witch gave him some radishes, all he could carry. She was so happy. And he went back home and he told his wife what had happened, and she ate the salad, but it just didn't taste as good this time because she knew that her baby was going to be taken away from her. Well, after a few months, the wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl with long golden hair. And she was so pretty and she was so precious, and her parents were so terrified that the witch was going to come and take the baby away right away. Well, the odd thing was, it seemed that the witch perhaps had left the town, for her garden began to look overgrown and no one had seen her in months. And so the father and mother began to feel that perhaps their baby was safe. And after 6 months or 9 months, they kind of forgot about the witch and the promise that they had made to her. Until one night, when the baby was about 2 years old and toddling around the room. It was stormy that night, and dark and cloudy, and there was lightning in the sky, but the rain was not yet falling. And suddenly, there was a pounding knock at the door. And when the father went to the door and opened it up, there was the witch. And she said, "I have come for what you promised me." And the father and the mother begged and they pleaded with the witch not to take their little girl. But the witch would not listen. She picked up the little girl and she disappeared into the night with her. And even though the father grabbed his coat and went after them, he could not find them anywhere. Well, the witch took the little girl and she wrapped her in her cloak, and the little girl fell asleep in her arms, and she began to walk. And she traveled deep into the forest, where she had built a little tower. And she took the little girl, and she took her into the tower, and she laid her down in a little bed in the tower. And then by her magic, she closed up the door so that there was no door for anyone to find their way into the tower. And then she made the tower grow taller and taller and taller and taller until it was as tall as the tallest trees. And then the next morning, when the little girl woke up, the witch sat her down and began to brush her hair. And as she brushed her hair, the little girl's hair grew longer and longer and longer until when they braided it all up and hooked it over a hook on the window, it reached all the way down to the ground, the braid. And the witch named the little girl Rapunzel. And she taught her to hook her braid up on the window, and then the witch climbed down the braid. And she left. And she would come back every single day, and she would visit Rapunzel. Now, there was no door in the tower, so she would call to Rapunzel to let down her hair, and Rapunzel would hook up her braid on the little hook and let it fall down to the ground, and the witch would climb up the braid. Well, after many years had passed, when Rapunzel was about 18, there was a prince in the neighboring area, and he and his friends and courtiers and soldiers, they went on a hunt. They went hunting for the great stag that lived in the forest. But in the middle of the hunt, the prince saw something off to the side, and he veered off to find out what it was, and he got lost, as often happens when someone leaves their group in the middle of the forest. And so the prince was wandering round on his horse through the forest, trying to figure out how he was going to find his way back to his castle. He heard the most beautiful voice singing a beautiful song. Well, that was not any bird. Perhaps the person who belonged to that voice could tell him how to get out of the forest. And so he followed the sound. And when he followed the sound, eventually he found, suddenly, in the middle of all of the trees, there was a great big tower. It's a very tall tower. Well, when the prince backed up a little bit, he could see a window at the top of the tower, and he could see a girl with beautiful golden hair standing in the window and singing a song. Well, she looked quite lovely from the ground, and he very much would like to meet her. And besides, he needed directions out of the forest. And so he began walking around the bottom of the tower, trying to find the door so that he could get in and ask this girl how to get out of the forest. But as he walked around the tower, and around the tower, and around the tower, he found that there was no door. Well, if there's no door into the tower, how did she get in there? And he could not figure it out. And so he sat down at the edge of the forest to listen to her sing and to try to figure out how to get into that tower. Well, after a little while, he heard someone coming. And, well, the prince was a cautious man. He knew better than to just jump out and say boo. That would not be a good plan. He did not know who these people were, and there was a girl stuck in a tower with no door in it. How did she get there? Probably magic. So probably not a good idea to make himself known to whoever it was that was coming through the forest. And so he slipped back a little bit so that he was tucked behind some bushes, and he just watched. And as he watched, he was very glad he had hidden. For soon out of the forest came a bent old figure, walking. She was all in black, and she looked so much like a witch. He had no doubt that was exactly what she was. And she walked to the bottom of the tower, and she put her head back, and she called up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, that I may climb its golden stair." And suddenly, down from the tower tumbled a very long golden braid. And the witch grabbed hold of it, and she began to climb the braid. Well, now the prince knew how to get into the tower. But he definitely did not want to go into the tower while the witch was there, and so he waited. And after a little while, the witch came back down. But by then, it was getting dark. And the prince, he was tired. He was kind of hungry. Being lost is very tiring. So he decided that he was going to sleep there on the ground in the forest. Wasn't as comfortable as his bed at home, but he could make do. And then the next morning, when it was light, then he would try to get into the tower. Well, the next morning, he looked very carefully, didn't see any sign of the witch. And so he went to the bottom of the tower and he called up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, throw down your hair that I may climb its golden stair." That sounded about right. He wasn't exactly sure of the words, but that sounded about right. And suddenly, down tumbled the golden braid and up climbed the prince. Now, when he climbed into that tower room, what he saw was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. And what Rapunzel saw was not her mother. It was a man. It must be a man, for he rather looked like the father she could bear. It must be a man. Well, Rapunzel was quite startled and quite frightened, and so she rather was hiding a bit. But the young man was so kind, and he spoke to her so gently, that eventually she came forward and she told him her story of how she came to be in the tower. And the prince said, "Well, I am a prince, and I've gotten lost in the forest, and I'm trying to find my way home, but I heard you singing. And I thought, perhaps you might be able to tell me the way home." And she said, "Oh, well, I am sorry. I barely remember before I was in this tower, and I do not know how I got here. My mother brought me here when I was sleeping." But wait a moment. "There is something I have seen from the window." And she took the prince over to the window, and she had him stand in just the right place, and she said, "Do you see just over there? There's some spikes and some waving things." And he said, "Yes, yes, that's the top of the towers and the flags on my father's castle. Yes, all right, so if I go down the tower, I need to go that way. Thank you very much. Won't you come with me?" And she said, "Well, I can't. You see, the only way down is to put my hair up on this hook and hang it down the window. And, well, I can't be up here and hanging my hair down and down there and climbing down. I just can't." And he said, "Well, I will come up with a way to save you, and I will come back for you. In fact, I will come back every day if I can, and I will visit you." Because by this point, the prince was just a little bit in love with this very pretty, very sweet girl that he had found in the tower. And Rapunzel, well, she'd never really met anybody else, so she was just a little bit in love with the prince too. Well, the prince climbed down from the tower, and he went back to his father's castle. But he kept his promise. Every single day, he came back to the tower. And before too long, Rapunzel and the prince had fallen completely in love with each other and had decided to get married. Well, before they could do that, of course, Rapunzel had to get out of the tower. So the prince and Rapunzel, they promised to always love each other and to always be husband and wife. And then the prince left, and he said, "When I get a ladder long enough, I will come back. And I am sure I can come back tomorrow with a long enough ladder." Rapunzel said, "All right, I'll be waiting for you." Well, she was thinking so much about her prince and escaping with him and going to his kingdom and hoping that his parents would like her, that she wasn't as careful as she should have been when the witch came to see her that afternoon. So when the witch came to see her, and she called up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair that I may climb its golden stair," Rapunzel let down her braid. And she was still thinking about her prince as the witch climbed the braid. And when the witch got to the top of the braid, Rapunzel looked at her and said, "Mother, why is it that you take so long to climb my hair, but the prince is up in a jiffy?" Well, the witch was not happy to hear the word prince come from Rapunzel's mouth. She wanted to keep Rapunzel all to herself. And she was so angry with Rapunzel for having disobeyed her and had someone else in the tower that she took Rapunzel and she chopped off her braid. Cut it off right at the back. Rapunzel was so upset. She knew she'd said the wrong thing. She tried to beg forgiveness, but the witch was not listening. In fact, she took Rapunzel and she took her by magic and she took her out to the wilderness and she left her right there in a wild place near the edge of the desert and the edge of the forest. Well, Rapunzel was very sad because she had lost her prince. But the witch went back to the tower and she waited. And she waited. And before too long, she heard a voice call, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair that I may climb its golden stair." And so the witch went to the window and she hooked the braid onto the hook and she threw it down. And the prince climbed up the braid. But when he came into the room, he did not find his Rapunzel. Oh no, he found a very angry, wicked witch. And she started to come at him, and she was saying that she was going to turn him into a toad and have a skunk eat him, or a fox, but she would make him a statue and smash him to pieces on the pavement. And as she came toward him, the prince backed up and backed up and backed up, and he backed up so far that he hit the window and he fell out. And he fell down to the bottom of the tower. Now, he did not break his head, as you might expect, For you see, at the bottom of the tower were a bunch of bushes that had grown up. And he got caught in the bushes and he got hung up, so he didn't hurt himself too badly. But the bushes had thorns, and they poked his face and his eyes so much that he lost the use of his eyes. He was completely blind. He could not see. And he began wandering, sad, lonesome, knowing that his Rapunzel was gone somewhere. He didn't know where. And so he wandered the world for about 2 years. And then, one day, as he was wandering, he heard someone singing. And he knew that voice. That was the voice of his Rapunzel. And so he began to go towards the voice, and he called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, Rapunzel." And she heard him. And she knew that voice too. That was the voice of her prince. And so she went and she found him, and she brought him back to her little hut that she had made out of some trees and some branches. And she took him in her arms, and she hugged him, and she kissed him, and she cried over him. And as she cried over him, something magical happened. Her tears fell on his blind eyes, and suddenly they were healed, and he could see again. And what he saw was his beautiful Rapunzel. And the next thing he saw was 2 little children, about 2 years old, a little boy and a little girl. Rapunzel had had babies after the witch had thrown her out of the tower. Well, the prince was so happy to find Rapunzel and the children. He was a father, that he took her in his arms and he hugged her and he kissed her and he said, "Let's go home now." And so they picked up the children, 1 each, and they began to walk. And before too long, they found that they actually weren't too terribly far away from his father's kingdom. And so they went back to his father's castle, and they were welcomed home with open arms, for the king had thought that he had lost his son. And suddenly his son came back to him with a wife and 2 children, and it was wonderful. And everyone was so, so happy. And the king sent out word that if anyone ever saw that witch again, they were to bring her to him for punishment. But you know, after she had thrown the prince out of the tower, she had left the area for good. She never came back. No one ever saw her again. But Rapunzel and her prince lived very happily, and eventually they became the king and queen of the kingdom, and they ruled very, very wisely, and were very happy, and so were their people. And that is the story of Rapunzel, which comes to us from Europe. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Central Time, when we will have another story for you from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. See you later. Bye.